Welcome back to PTE Plus online lessons. Today we're going to be talking about the top 5 things that you don't want to do in the read aloud section. First of all, what we want to avoid is not to speak in a flat tone and read the context word by word. What do I mean by that? A lot of students will just have this sort of flat pitch and they'll read each word individually. It'll sound something similar to this: speak at a flat tone and read the context word by word. And that's something we really want to avoid, because you see, if you read like that, when you analyze the sound waves, it'll sound like da 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 da, and there won't be any sort of high waves or low waves, and everything's just going to be a blur in the middle. And that's something that we definitely want to avoid, and it's a fatal mistake in the PTE exam. And this is perhaps one of the biggest reasons why a lot of people get almost 0 for the fluency section, and a lot of people will get 10 to 20, and it's because you don't really have any sort of fluctuation in pitch. Remember what we said before, right? The PTE has its own set example of answers in which they get 100 native speakers and they all read the same passage, and the passage has ups and downs, and we have to get as close to the ups and downs, which is stress and non-stress patterns, as the native speakers. So if you're reading like this: food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. So if you're reading like that without any sort of discernible up and down pitch, without any discernible sentence and word stress, you're definitely on your way to getting a 0. So let's defer back to the PTE official website and see what their guide says. It tells us that we need to stress the words that carry information. When you read the text, stress the words that help to convey meaning by reading them in a slightly louder voice and adding emphasis to key syllables. So you'll notice the way I was reading that, I wasn't giving everything the same sort of tone. I was definitely emphasizing key words, and that some words were definitely louder and had more emphasis. And in that way, we're adding meaning to it. And that's what the PT exam is ultimately looking for. So going back to the passage earlier, notice how now we're going with a more rhythmic feel. Da 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 da, bum bum bum, bum bum bum. Instead of saying something like, food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, we're going into, food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy. Notice how it's going up and down, up and down. This sort of up and down rhythm is created by using stress words and non-stress words in conjunction. And that's exactly what we need to do to achieve a higher score. Food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy. And yet, most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. People spend a lot of time worrying about what kinds of blue jeans to wear, what kind of video games to play, what kind of computers to buy. Notice how this up and down feeling is definitely created. And you can see that up and down feeling in the sound waves that you're going to be creating when you're reading this. Let's zoom in on that last particular sentence. Instead of what kind of computers to buy, it'd be what kind of computers to buy. What kind of computers to buy? And you can definitely see the sort of up-down feeling towards it, and that's what we need to be looking for. And failing to do this will end up giving us a score of 0 for it being non-English. Here in the PT official website, it says pronunciation seems completely characteristic of another language, because in English we definitely have stress syllables and non-stress syllables. A good example to insert here would be Japanese students. A lot of Japanese students might pronounce the word like Toyota instead of Toyota. And when you're pronouncing it Toyota, it sounds like stress is equal on every single word, whereas in English, Toyota, there's definitely this up-down stress where words and sounds are stressed, and there are also non-stress sounds. And for Indian students, a lot of the times they'll go strawberry. Instead of strawberry, it should be strawberry. So when you get the stress patterns wrong, it'll be indicative of another language. And you can see here, stressed and unstressed syllables are realized in a non-English manner, and that'll result in 0. So this is one of the most fatal mistakes that a lot of students make, and it's probably one of the biggest things we should be looking at avoiding. The second most fatal mistakes is perhaps speak without pausing. A lot of you will end up having a lot of hesitation and a lot of pauses when you speak. You'll notice that the PT website only gives us 2 very specific tips, and the second tip deals with pausing. It says, use punctuation to help you decide where to pause when you read. Obviously, in the English language, whenever we're reading, we're going to be using punctuation marks as a way to decide where we pause. So punctuation marks, if you don't remember, include things like comma, full stops, and dashes. So any sort of punctuation, there'll always be a small pause. So it reads here, you have 30 to 40 seconds to read the text before using the microphone. So use this time to break the text up into meaningful chunks using punctuation as a guide. So the reason why they say punctuation as a guide is because punctuation is not the only place you're pausing. You're also pausing at the end of phrases. The first function for pausing is that it allows us to take a deep breath in the middle of a sentence. A lot of these sentences are going to be very long, especially because it's really academic in nature. So let's have a look at this. The first sentence goes all the way from photograph to public. There's no way I'm going to get through that. Photographs gaze wide during the early years of the 20th century, and as the snapshot camera became... I'm out of breath already. And I have good breath. So a lot of us will run out of breath long before we get to increasingly. So that's the first function of having pauses, to let us catch our breath. The second function is for our eyes to scan ahead while we're pausing. So what does that even mean? Let's explore it. If you were to engage in reading without pausing, the result will be like, food is one of the most important things you will ever buy, and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. So that's going to be likely if you just try to read everything in one breath and you don't take pauses. It's also emblematic of when your eyes and your mouth aren't keeping up in the same pace. So we take pauses in order for our eyes to scan ahead while our mouth catches up with the sort of phrases. And if we're to apply the principles that we learned from our other lessons, ultimately we'll end up with something like this. When we do apply pauses, it'll sound a lot more fluent and it'll sound a lot better because we'll be dividing it into phrases. For example, this one goes like this. Food is one of the most important things. Pause. And because we're pausing here, we're allowing our eyes to read ahead. You'll ever buy, and yet most people, and then so on. Now the problem is that if you don't pause here, what's going to happen is you're going to be reading it like this. Food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, and yet, hang on a second, why didn't we pause here? The problem is that because we're not in the mentality to pause, we're just going to be constantly reading whatever word that comes next, and as a result, we won't be even pausing for punctuation marks, let alone for the end of phrases. Another function that pausing allows is that it'll give us proper stress and proper connected reading, for example. And yet most people never bother to think about their food. Because we're pausing here, we'll know that and is very soft and it's unstressed, and where it comes from, and where. Notice how and is connected to where. If we're not pausing, giving our eyes a chance to read ahead, we'll never be able to pronounce this and treat this word correctly. So that's why it's very important for us to be able to pause here. As a result, it's important for us to realize here that the read aloud section not only tests our ability to actually talk, speak, and pronounce things, but it's also testing our ability to be able to comprehend what we read, our comprehension ability in the 30 to 40 second preparation time that we're given to break it up into meaningful chunks. And if we lack that comprehension ability, then obviously we'll be suffering in the long run. And you'll see that if you don't pause, it's sort of a cascading effect. It goes worse to worse. If we fail to pause, we fail to give the full meaning of the text by not reading phrases, and we will fail to pronounce words clearly. Because we're not pausing, we're going to be reading faster and faster, and these faster words will not be picked up clearly by the machine because we're not separating into syllables and we're not having sentence level stress. And because we're not pronouncing it correctly and we're reading it too quickly, as a result, we're guaranteed to have hesitation and repetition. The pauses allow us to remove hesitation and repetition by giving us a chance to read ahead and get our brains used to what's coming next. So this is one of the fatal mistakes in the PT Read Aloud section, and it's one of the things that we need to really be careful to avoid and to apply the principles of connected speech and having a slow and clear pronunciation. Okay, so the next topic is stressing every word or distorted word stress. So what does this mean exactly? Let's break it down for you. The first example I'm going to be showing you would be incorrect word stress. So for example, you might think to yourself, hey, I know the PT requires me to have word stress. What if I just put word stress everywhere? Give it to you in abundance. What does it look like? Let me show you. Food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where. So that's an example of too much stress, where every single word is stress. So first of all, obviously it sounds unnatural to us, right? It sounds super weird, and that should be ringing alarm bells in your head. You'll be going, that's not right. And secondly, remember how I said about how the PT gets its answers? It'll get 100 native speakers and they'll all read into the machine, and the machine will store an average of the sound waves. So when the native speaker says this sentence, they'll say food is one of the most, in that case of the is not stressed and they've got small sound waves, one of the most. But for you, if you're pronouncing it like food is one of the most and of the, you're stressing these sounds, it'll come up as higher waves. So when the PT machine takes your answer and it compares it with its model answer, it'll see that these waves are in incorrect positions, and as a result, it'll define it as having incorrect stress, and you'll end up getting a very, very low mark, an extremely low mark if you have mistakes like that. Another instance of stress-related error is, for example, when you're reading things like important things. So instead of important things having an up and down, you're just having stress in weird places and the incorrect places. Important things you'll ever buy. And the problem with this is that if you just have incorrect stress in one location, like people never bother to think about their food, all of a sudden your whole sentence will be led awry and you'll be led in the wrong direction. So it's important to establish this sort of stress pattern in your speech. People never bother to think about their food. People never bother to think about their food. Having this up-down sort of rhythmic feel in every single word you have will help you establish this sort of natural word stress pattern, which sounds really natural, and it's what the PT looks for. So it's important to remember that not only do we need to have correct stress in phrases to have words that are not stressed, but it's also important to have correct stress within individual words. Okay, moving on to the next section. Another fatal mistake that a lot of students make is being too slow and lacking in phrasing. A lot of people here might ask, do I need to read quickly for the read loud section? And in short, yes, you do need to read quickly for the read loud section in order to get a good fluency mark, but it's not all about speed. It's not so fast that it becomes sort of unnatural. So let's have a look at this passage and analyze it. So it'll never be like, food is one of the most important you ever bite, because remember what I said before? It's important to pronounce each syllable in every word clearly, and it's important to have word stress. So if you're speaking too quickly, you'll end up losing syllables and you'll end up losing word stress in there as well. So ultimately, we need to have a speed that's comfortable for us. You'll also get lots of students who say, oh, you want me to break into chunks? Okay, I can do that. Let me break into chunks for you. Food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. So to these students, you're going a bit overboard. That's too much pausing and it's too much breaking. And if you're pausing this much, you'll end up getting a really, really low fluency score. So we really don't want to aim for that. And you'll sound really unnatural as well, which is a good indicator. So for most of our students who want to learn how much is too much and how much should I be pausing, typically we will aim to have around about 3 or 4 content words in each phrase. And if you're having anything less than 3 or 4 content words, then you'll end up sounding like you're pausing too much, and it'll come across as non-fluent. For example, someone who's fluent in English is never going to say, food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy. Someone who's fluent in English would most likely just do the whole sentence. Food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy. So when you're practicing, you can always play around with your own boundaries. Like, for example, you can read this sentence and think about whether or not it's too long for you and whether or not you'll need to take a breath. So in practice, you can be like, food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy. Oh, that felt alright, that was okay. I was able to get through that entire sentence without having any sort of hesitation or having to run out of breath. And let's experiment with the second sentence. And yet, most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. So, it's a bit too much, right? It's a bit too much for me to read that whole chunk without having breath. So, let's mark one place for us to take a breath. So, let's mark it here. We're going to take a breath here. and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. So that's much more natural, right? And it's a lot better for us to treat it like that. So with a lot of these sort of phrases, you can sort of experiment around and see what feels natural to you and what your limit is in terms of how much you can read. And remember, that's what practice is there for. Practice is for you to discover your limits and to discover what it is you should do. And for the next sentence, the same concept applies. If you're breaking up into too many chunks, you'll end up losing fluency marks. People spend a lot of time worrying about what kind of blue jeans to wear. So that's an example of non-fluent speaking. So instead, I might just choose to pause, say here. People spend a lot of time worrying about what kind of blue jeans to wear, what kind of video games to play, what kind of computers to buy. So the takeaway from this is have an acceptable speed to you. Don't go too quickly. And remember, it's important to have meaningful chunks in your sentences. But don't chunk too much. I know you have the ability to chunk, so don't over chunk, don't overdo it, don't chunk at every single possible instance. Don't be like, people spend a lot of time worrying about, so don't over chunk it, be natural and try to include 3 to 4 content words in one go. And if you can, just do the entire sentence in one go. Know your own limits. Okay, let's move on to the final problem that a lot of students will have, which is irregular speed and irregular stress. I want you to remember one thing. Being natural is always king in the PT examinations. Whatever you do, make sure that you sound natural. A lot of students, once having acquired the techniques of, saying having stress and having different sort of phrasing speeds and having chunks, they'll overdo it. They'll apply it to pretty much everything. They'll read it a little bit like this. Food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. So in that particular case, everything just sounds weird. What you're producing is a really weird set of sound waves, and it's not going to match up to the correct answers. And remember, we said that the correct answers are just native speakers reading this passage. So it's going to match up the sound waves, and it's going to be all over the place, and you're going to end up with a fairly low score. So remember, the key here is just to do what sounds most natural to you, okay? So a lot of words like things, just read it naturally. No one's going to say important things. People will say important things, just treat it naturally. And then on the other hand, you'll get students who just sort of put stress in wherever they want. They'll be like, hey, you said you wanted a rhythmic feel, right? So I'm going to give you a rhythmic feel, like da 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 da. They'll end up reading like, food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. People spend a lot of more time worrying about what kind of blue jeans to wear. So for those sort of students, yes, they do have stress, but the problem is they're stressing it in all the wrong locations, and what's going to happen is, once again, they're going to match up your answer with the correct answer that they have, and it's going to show that you have incorrect stress and it's all over the place, and it's quite possible that you'll end up getting 0 for fluency if you speak that way. There is a correct way to read it, and there isn't multiple correct ways to read it. So in the correct sense, you don't have to sort of yell out every single word to give it stress. You don't have to go, food is one of the... You can just sort of be natural. Food, right? That's very natural. One, most important things ever buy. Just be natural about it. You don't have to sort of overemphasize everything. Naturalness is king in this particular section. So I'm going to leave you with a correct pronunciation of this passage and a pronunciation that you should be aiming for this particular passage. Food is one of the most important things you'll ever buy, and yet most people never bother to think about their food and where it comes from. People spend a lot more time worrying about what kind of blue jeans to wear, what kind of video games to play, what kind of computers to buy. And you can see it was very natural, right? That's right, that's exactly what we're aiming for. So I hope you guys remembered these are the 5 common mistakes that people make in the read aloud section, and these are the sort of things that you want to be avoiding if you want to achieve a high mark, and obviously we'll get a much lower score if we end up making these sort of mistakes. So that's all we have time for today on PT Plus Online. I hope to see you again very soon.